Okay, so in this section we're going to talk about basically the factors that affect muscle contraction. So in terms of generating force of muscle contraction, it depends on the number of cross bridges that are attached, when myosin attaches to actin. And this is affected by four main factors. First of all, the number of muscle fibers that are actually stimulated or recruited to be stimulated. And the more motor units that are recruited, the greater the amount of force that can be produced by that whole muscle. Also, what depends on how much force is produced is the relative size of those fibers, right? The bulkier the muscle, the more tension it can develop. Because muscle cells can increase in size or hypertrophy with regular exercise because these individual cells can make more myofibrils. We also can generate more contraction force based on the frequency of stimulation. So if you increase the action potential frequency going out to muscle, this is going to generate more force because these stimuli are added together. You flood the synapse with acetylcholine, which means you have more end plate potential and even more action potentials in the muscle cell, so that muscle twitches can start to add together or summate. Now, the degree of muscle stretch also affects how much contraction can be produced. So we find that if muscle fibers whose sarcomeres are at 80 to 120% of their normal resting length, this can generate the most force. And if sarcomere's length is less than 80% of its resting length, the filaments overlap too much and the force decreases. And it's the opposite too here. If sarcomeres are greater than 120% of their resting length, the sarcomeres are stretched too much. The filaments don't overlap enough so that the force decreases. And so just to summarize these four major factors here, remember the number of muscle fibers that are recruited can increase contractile force. How large those muscle fibers are, that can also increase contractile force. If you go from a smaller fiber type to larger fibers through hypertrophy, like regular use of the muscles will make these cells get larger because they're going to start to generate more myofibrils. Well, if the cells are larger because they have more myofibrils, there's more sarcomeres, which means you can produce more contraction. Also, a higher frequency of stimulation can lead to things like wave summation or even fused tetanus, and that's going to increase contraction force through summation of muscle twitches. Or, depending on the stretch of that muscle, that can also increase contractile force. Remember, if the muscles are between 80 and 120% of their resting length, this is going to produce the most force because the sarcomeres are in their optimal position. If sarcomeres overlap too much, or if they're stretched too much, the fibers aren't, going to have as much contact, so therefore the sarcomeres can't generate as much contractile force. So just to summarize those four major factors, remember the number of fibers recruited, the size of the fibers, the frequency of stimulation, and the length of that muscle also can increase contractile force. So what this figure is showing here is essentially the relationship of tension versus the percent resting length of the sarcomere. And you can see here that there's a tendency then for sarcomere length to affect tension that can be produced. And so if you look here, we see that the most amount of tension that the sarcomeres can produce is when they're at 100% of their resting length. So if sarcomeres at their 100% of resting length, you find here that myosin filament can overlap very well with the actin filament. So there's a lot of potential contact sites here, which means that this sarcomere in this position has the most potential to produce the most tension, which is what we see here. So, a sarcomere at 100% of its resting length will produce 100% of its maximal tension. However, if sarcomeres are kind of compressed, you see there's a general tendency for tension that's able to be produced to go down. And this is because when sarcomeres start to overlap, you find that the myosin filament has less potential contact sites here now with actin because they're overlapping. And because of this, there's less available binding sites, which means that less myosin heads can actually bind, and therefore you're going to produce less tension as a result. So a sarcomere that's at 80% of its resting length can only produce, about 80% of its, maximal tension. And the opposite goes for the other extreme. So if sarcomeres are excessively stretched, where you might find that the thin filaments barely overlap with our thick filament, we see here then that there's even less potential contact here between the myosin heads and the thin filament, which means that at 170% of its resting length, we see that the sarcomeres can only produce about 20% of its maximal tension. And so what's interesting then is if you're thinking about applying this to regular day-to-day activities, it's important to note then that wherever your muscles are before you start to perform an activity is going to depend on how much contraction force those muscles can produce as a result. So for instance, if you're going to lift some weights, you probably don't want to start then at the most stretched state of those muscles because you're going to really resist, and there's going to be a large struggle then to actually produce enough tension to lift those weights. Rather, it's better to start at a relaxed state or relaxed position because from that position then you can produce the most force. So it turns out that velocity and duration of contraction can also vary. And so what can influence the velocity and duration of a muscle contraction are factors like muscle fiber type, the amount of load that's placed on that muscle, as well as the number of muscle fibers that are recruited. So muscle fiber type can vary. And what's kind of weird here is that not all muscle fibers or muscle cells are the same. And they can be divided into several main categories here by the speed of contraction and the type of metabolic pathways these cells actually rely on. So if the muscle twitches that these cells produce are fast, we call them fast fibers. And if the muscle twitches that these cells produce are more slow, they're slower fibers. Ultimately, this relates to the speed of the myosin ATPase and the pattern of electrical activity in these types of cells. Now, metabolic pathways also can influence how these muscle cells respond to stimuli. Like oxidative fibers use aerobic pathways because they can use oxygen. Glycolytic fibers rely on glycolysis, which are more an anaerobic type of metabolism. So what we find here is that there's two criteria that really tell us about fiber type. Remember, if it's slow or fast, or whether it uses oxidative or glycolytic metabolic pathways. So there's three major fiber types we're going to talk about here. We got the slow oxidative, and fast glycolytic muscle fibers. Now it turns out most of your muscles actually contain a mixture of all three fiber types. And this results in a range of contractile speed and fatigue resistance across your muscles. However, there are some muscles that can contain more of one fiber type than another. And this is dependent on things like your genetics as well as how you use the muscle over the course of your lifetime. So the different muscle fiber types are best suited for different jobs, right? So slow oxidative fibers are better used for low intensity endurance activities like maintaining posture. Like just keeping your back upright would require very low intensity, but you need to have endurance so that way your muscles don't get fatigued and your posture just slumps down and you fall to the floor. So fast oxidative fibers, though, are good for medium intensity activities like sprinting or walking, but not so much that you can run out of oxygen. It's good, sprinting or walking are aerobic types of activities where the muscle fibers aren't so active that they run out of oxygen, and so therefore they can still rely on oxidative metabolism. The fast glycolytic fibers, on the other hand, rely on more short-term, intense, or powerful movements. Examples of this would be like hitting a baseball, or if you're a sprinter, then you'd have more fast glycolytic fibers in those muscles that would promote those types of activities. So what we find here then is let's give an example here where if you want to have a high contractile velocity, what you're going to want then are a lot of the fast glycolytic fibers. However, these are more fatigable. So you don't want all of the muscles in your body to only have fast glycolytic fibers because that means we would only be able to move in very quick, short bursts where we fatigue very rapidly. Opposite to this, if you want to have a long contractile duration, what we have then are slow oxidative fibers, which are much more fatigue resistant, but their onset of maximal tension is much more slow. And this also wouldn't make sense for all your muscles because although you can have a long contractile duration, you also wouldn't be able to move very fast. So let's say, for example, we need to have something in between, right? Like if you're going to bicep curl this ice cream cone with like strawberry ice cream in it, you might want to get that to your face quickly, which means you're going to want to have a lot of fast glycolytic fibers, right? That way you can lift it up fast and then get it close to your face. But you also want to be able to hold that ice cream cone there in the long term, now we can lick the ice cream and actually enjoy it. In that regard, you're going to want to rely on more on the slow oxidative fibers, which are more fatigue resistant. So in this regard, it turns out muscles like your biceps are going to have a mixture of these fiber types. That way it kind of promotes the things that we do on a day-to-day basis, like eating ice cream cones. So just to compare these three fiber types, remember we have slow and fast oxidative as well as fast glycolytic fibers. Remember, if they're oxidative, then we're actually relying on oxygen metabolism, like aerobic pathways. And if it's glycolytic, we're relying on anaerobic metabolism, like glycolysis. So for the slow and fast varieties, this ultimately refers to the speed of the myosin ATPase. So the myosin ATPase is just the speed of the myosin head. And so if they're slower, that's going to make it a slow fiber because you have slower twitch. And if those myosin ATPase is faster, that's what makes this a fast fiber. So the speed of contraction is dependent on these myosin ATPases. Now the primary pathway for ATP synthesis for the slow oxidative fibers is just aerobic metabolism, like glycolysis, Krebs cycle, oxidative phosphorylation. This produces a large amount of ATP, but it's about 2.5 times slower than if you relied on glycolysis, which makes sense why you'd want to have this type of metabolism in slow oxidative fibers. Now the fast oxidative fibers rely on aerobic metabolism, but also a little bit of anaerobic glycolysis, just depending on what you're doing. Now the oxidative fibers, because they rely on oxygen, also have high amounts of myoglobin. And myoglobin is a protein that helps you to store oxygen in the muscle. And it makes sense that if you have muscle fibers that rely on oxygen for their source of metabolism and ATP synthesis, you want to have a lot of this myoglobin, which actually helps to hold on to extra oxygen to help supply metabolism to these muscles. Now myoglobin has kind of a reddish, darkish color to it, so that the muscles that are redder and darker have more myoglobin content. And that's what we see here. Like with the color of these fibers, they're going to be more red or red to pink, and this is dependent on their myoglobin content. Now, glycogen is also a way for our muscle cells to store sugar for later use, and we find that oxidative fibers store, a moderate amount, low to an intermediate amount of glycogen. They're not particularly relying on glycolysis for ATP, so they don't need a whole lot of glycogen stored here. Now, the slow oxidative fibers are actually recruited first, and because they're fatigue resistant. The fast oxidative fibers are recruited second, and this is because they're moderately fatigue resistant. And the fast glycolytic fibers are actually recruited third, and they're more of a fast twitch, but they fatigue more rapidly. And because these fatigue more rapidly, it makes sense that you want these other fibers to already be activated. That way, once these fatigue and the twitch goes away, you still have other fibers that are activated and contracting. That way your muscles don't just relax all at the same time suddenly. So in terms of what these types of fibers are good for, slow and fast oxidative fibers are good for sort of moderate to medium types of activities. Like slow oxidative fibers are good for endurance activities like running a marathon or maintaining your posture. The fast oxidative fibers are good for like sprinting or walking. Whereas the fast glycolytic fibers, these rely on anaerobic glycolysis, which means that they don't use a whole lot of oxygen here for ATP synthesis. They're fast because their myosin ATPase is fast. However, because they rely on anaerobic pathways, they don't need a lot of myoglobin, so their myoglobin content's low, which makes these fibers kind of white or pale in appearance. Their glycogen stores are high because they need a lot of stored sugar to power glycolysis. And they're more fatigable, which means that these things don't last very long. They're good for quick bursts of energy, which is why these fast glycolytic fibers are better for short-term, intense or powerful movements like hitting a baseball or sprinting. Now, in terms of the structural characteristics, the fiber diameter here of the fast glycolytics are intermediate or so. They have very few mitochondria because they rely on anaerobic metabolism. They have very few capillaries or blood vessels because, again, they don't need a whole lot of oxygen delivery. And the fibers are going to be kind of white in appearance. Their color is white because they don't have a lot of myoglobin or mitochondria. So think of it like white meat. That's going to be fast glycolytic fibers, which have more glycogen. Now, the fast oxidative and slow oxidative fibers are darker and more red because of lots of capillaries, because of lots of mitochondria, and because of their myoglobin stores. Now the fiber diameter is also different here, where the slow oxidative fibers are smaller, and it makes sense that these are actually recruited first because, remember we talked about the recruitment order was based on the size principle, where these smaller muscle fibers are actually recruited first. So in terms of load and recruitment, we understand that that load is basically where, it's a sort of the amount of force that a muscle needs to resist. So that muscles actually contract the fastest when there's no load added. And that makes sense. Like if there's no load on the muscle, they're going to be able to contract very, very quickly. Now, the greater the load, the shorter the distance of the contraction, and the greater the load, also the slower the contraction, because you have to pull quite a bit of force. Now, the recruitment also depends on the motor units that are activated, and this is actually going to promote different types of contractions. So what we find here then is for heavy loads, you have a very short distance of muscle contraction, and the muscle is going to fatigue more rapidly. In terms of lighter loads, like let's say no load at all, like you just lift your arms up, but they're not resisting anything but their own weight, they're going to have a really quick contraction that's also a very short distance that they're going to move, and this can actually happen longer because they're more fatigue resistant. Now, we also see that increasing the load changes the velocity of shortening. So if there's almost no load, muscles contract very rapidly. If there's a really large load, muscles will contract very slowly because they're having to pull really strongly against that load that they're sort of resisting.